Every day at precisely 10 a.m., in a marble temple in Washington, D.C., a solemn ritual begins. Visitors from across America line up in reverential silence as armed guards ceremoniously raise a bulletproof case containing 4 yellowed pages of parchment. The lighting is carefully controlled, the temperature precisely regulated, and the atmosphere hushed with an almost religious awe. People weep as they view these documents. They place their hands over their hearts. Some whisper prayers. They are not viewing religious relics in a cathedral. They are looking at the Constitution of the United States in the National Archives. But here's what will shock you. This reverence for a political document is almost uniquely American. In most democracies, constitutions are viewed as practical governing frameworks, amended regularly and discussed pragmatically. Only in America has a founding document achieved the status of Holy Scripture, complete with original sin, prophetic founders, sacred interpretation, and fundamentalist believers who insist every word was divinely inspired and eternally perfect. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden forces that shaped our world. What you're about to discover is one of the most fascinating aspects of American political culture. How a nation built on Enlightenment rationalism developed an almost mystical relationship with a legal document written by flawed, pragmatic politicians over 2 centuries ago. This story will reveal why Americans quote the Constitution like Scripture, why Supreme Court justices are treated like high priests, and why constitutional debates in America often resemble theological disputes more than legal arguments. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of how law became liturgy, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because what we're about to explore will change how you understand American political culture forever. And I'm genuinely curious about our global community. Drop a comment telling me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. I love seeing how this uniquely American phenomenon looks to people around the world. The story begins not with reverence, but with profound skepticism. When the Constitutional Convention concluded in Philadelphia in September 1787, few Americans viewed their new governing document as sacred. In fact, many viewed it with deep suspicion. Consider the words of Patrick Henry, the fiery Virginia orator who refused to attend the Constitutional Convention. "I smell a rat," he declared when asked why he wouldn't participate. When the proposed Constitution was published, Henry's worst fears seemed confirmed. "This Constitution," he thundered, "is said to have beautiful features, but when I come to examine these features, sir, they appear to me horribly frightful." Henry wasn't alone in his skepticism. Across the new nation, anti-federalists attacked the Constitution as a dangerous concentration of power that would destroy the liberty Americans had just fought to win. They demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms. They worried about creating a new monarchy. They feared the document gave too much power to distant elites and too little to ordinary citizens. Even the Constitution's supporters were remarkably candid about its flaws. James Madison, the document's primary architect, called it a work of human hands and acknowledged it was imperfect. Benjamin Franklin famously said he wasn't sure whether the sun carved on the convention president's chair was rising or setting, symbolizing his uncertainty about whether the Constitution would lead to American prosperity or decline. Alexander Hamilton went even further, calling the Constitution a frail and worthless fabric, and expressing doubt that any paper barriers could effectively restrain government power. These were not the words of men who believed they had created a sacred text. They were the words of practical politicians trying to solve immediate problems with an imperfect compromise. The transformation from skeptical pragmatism to religious reverence began almost immediately, driven by a crisis that threatened to destroy the new nation before it was barely established. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 presented the first major test of federal authority under the Constitution, and how it was resolved would establish precedents that elevated the document's status enormously. When Pennsylvania farmers rebelled against a federal tax on whiskey, President Washington faced a moment of truth. Would the new Constitution prove as ineffective as the Articles of Confederation had been? Washington's response was dramatic and decisive. He personally led 13,000 federal troops to suppress the rebellion, demonstrating that the Constitution gave the federal government real power to enforce its laws. But Washington did something else that was equally important for the Constitution's future mystique. He wrapped his actions in constitutional rhetoric that portrayed the document not just as law, but as the sacred foundation of American liberty. "The Constitution is the guide which I never will abandon," he declared, making defiance of federal law equivalent to sacrilege against the founding principles of the nation. This rhetorical strategy, using constitutional language to transform political disputes into moral crusades, would become a defining feature of American politics. Instead of simply enforcing tax law, Washington was defending constitutional government itself. Opposition to government policy became opposition to the Constitution, and opposition to the Constitution became opposition to America itself. The real architect of constitutional worship, however, was not a politician but a judge, John Marshall, the fourth Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. When Marshall took office in 1801, the Supreme Court was so weak and irrelevant that it didn't even have its own building. It met in the basement of the Capitol. When he died in 1835, the court had become what it remains today, the ultimate interpreter of constitutional meaning, and therefore one of the most powerful institutions in America. Marshall's genius was recognizing that constitutional interpretation could become a form of political power if wrapped in the rhetoric of legal objectivity. In case after case, Marshall claimed he was simply discovering what the Constitution already meant rather than making new policy. This transformed political judgments into constitutional revelations, making opposition to the court's decisions seem like opposition to the Constitution itself. Consider Marshall's reasoning in McCulloch v. Maryland, the 1819 case that established the federal government's implied powers. Maryland had tried to tax the national bank, and Marshall ruled this unconstitutional. But instead of simply ruling on the specific legal question, Marshall delivered a sweeping meditation on constitutional interpretation that reads more like theological commentary than legal analysis. "We must never forget that it is a constitution we are expounding," Marshall wrote, capitalizing the word constitution as if it were a proper noun referring to something sacred. He described the Constitution as designed to endure for ages to come and be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. This wasn't legal reasoning. It was constitutional mysticism that portrayed the document as almost divinely prescient. Marshall's approach created what legal scholars call constitutional theology, the idea that the Constitution contains eternal truths that trained interpreters can discover through careful study and contemplation. This transformed Supreme Court justices from judges into high priests and constitutional law, from legal practice into religious exercise. The Civil War marked the next crucial phase in the Constitution's transformation, from practical framework to sacred text. When the nation nearly destroyed itself over the question of slavery, both sides claimed constitutional authority for their positions. The result was a crisis that should have discredited constitutional worship, but instead intensified it. Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible constitutional puzzle. How could he preserve the Union while remaining faithful to a constitution that seemed to protect slavery? His solution was brilliant and transformative. He reinterpreted the Constitution's meaning by appealing to its underlying spirit rather than its literal text. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln argued that the Constitution's true meaning wasn't found in specific clauses, but in its overall purpose of creating a more perfect union. This allowed him to take extraordinary measures, suspending habeas corpus, imprisoning political opponents, emancipating slaves, while claiming constitutional authority for actions that seemed to violate constitutional provisions. Lincoln's approach established a precedent that would reshape American constitutional culture. The idea that the Constitution's true meaning transcends its written text and can only be understood by those with special insight into its deeper purposes. This transformed constitutional interpretation from legal analysis into prophetic revelation, with Lincoln as the great prophet who revealed the Constitution's true anti-slavery meaning. The Gettysburg Address represents perhaps the clearest example of constitutional theology in American history. Lincoln took a document written primarily to establish an effective national government and transformed it into a sacred covenant dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He accomplished this rhetorical magic by treating the Constitution not as a legal text, but as scripture that could be reinterpreted to reveal new truths. This theological approach to constitutional interpretation became standard practice after the Civil War. The 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection became a sacred principle that could be invoked to justify almost any expansion of federal power. The Commerce Clause became a divine mandate for federal regulation. The General Welfare Clause became authorization for the modern welfare state. But constitutional worship truly reached fever pitch in the Progressive era, when reformers used constitutional rhetoric to justify fundamental changes in American government and society. Instead of arguing that the Constitution was outdated and needed replacement, progressives claimed they were restoring its true meaning after decades of misinterpretation by conservative judges. Consider the transformation of constitutional interpretation between 1890 and 1940. In 1895, the Supreme Court ruled that a federal income tax was unconstitutional. By 1913, the 16th Amendment had authorized income taxation. In 1918, the court struck down federal child labor laws. By 1941, the court was upholding federal minimum wage laws. These weren't just policy changes, they were presented as constitutional revelations that discovered new meanings in ancient text. Franklin Roosevelt's presidency marked both the high point and the crisis of constitutional worship. When the Supreme Court struck down New Deal programs, Roosevelt didn't argue that the Constitution was obsolete. He argued that conservative justices were misinterpreting its true meaning. His court-packing plan wasn't presented as an attack on constitutional government, but as its salvation from judicial usurpers. Roosevelt's genius was recognizing that Americans would accept radical changes in government if they were presented as constitutional restoration rather than constitutional revolution. Instead of replacing the Constitution, he claimed to be fulfilling its true promise. This rhetorical strategy allowed him to expand federal power enormously while maintaining the fiction that he was simply following the founders' blueprint. The New Deal's constitutional revolution established patterns that continue today. Every major political movement claims constitutional authority. Conservatives invoke original intent to oppose change. Liberals appeal to evolving standards to justify innovation. Both sides treat their opponents not as political adversaries but as constitutional heretics who misunderstand America's founding principles. The Warren Court of the 1950s and 1960s represents perhaps the purest example of constitutional theology in American history. In case after case, the court discovered new constitutional rights, to privacy, to contraception, to abortion, that previous generations of lawyers and judges had somehow missed. These weren't presented as policy innovations, but as constitutional revelations that uncovered rights that had always existed but remained hidden. Brown v. Board of Education, the 1954 decision that outlawed school segregation, illustrates this theological approach perfectly. The 14th Amendment had been written and ratified by people who accepted racial segregation. The same Congress that passed the amendment established segregated schools in Washington, D.C. Yet the Warren Court ruled that segregation had always been unconstitutional because it violated the amendment's true meaning. This decision was legally revolutionary but constitutionally conservative. It claimed to restore rather than replace constitutional principles. The court didn't argue that the Constitution was wrong about segregation. It argued that segregation had never been constitutional in the first place. This allowed Americans to celebrate the decision as proof of the Constitution's wisdom, rather than evidence of its evolution. The 1960s and 1970s saw constitutional worship reach almost absurd heights. The right to privacy was discovered in penumbras and emanations from constitutional text. Environmental protection was found in constitutional clauses about interstate commerce. Consumer protection was justified through constitutional provisions about general welfare. Every political preference became a constitutional principle, and every constitutional principle became a divine mandate. But constitutional worship also produced a powerful backlash that continues today. Conservative legal scholars like Robert Bork and Antonin Scalia argued that liberal judges had abandoned constitutional interpretation for constitutional invention. They called for originalism, interpretation based on the Constitution's original meaning rather than its evolving significance. Originalism represents perhaps the purest form of constitutional fundamentalism in American history. Originalists treat the Constitution like religious fundamentalists treat Scripture, as a perfect text whose meaning was fixed at the moment of creation and can only be understood through careful study of the founders' original intent. This approach makes constitutional interpretation a form of historical archaeology aimed at discovering rather than creating constitutional meaning. The irony is that originalism, which claims to be more objective and democratic than living constitution interpretation, actually makes constitutional worship more intense rather than less. Instead of treating the Constitution as a framework that can adapt to changing circumstances, originalists treat it as eternal truth that transcends historical circumstance. This makes constitutional interpretation even more theological and makes originalist judges even more priest-like in their claims to special insight into constitutional meaning. Contemporary American politics illustrates how completely constitutional worship has permeated political culture. Every political movement claims constitutional authority. The Tea Party movement organized around constitutional principles. Black Lives Matter protests invoke constitutional rights. Immigration debates center on constitutional interpretation. Climate change activism appeals to constitutional values. This constitutional rhetoric transforms every policy dispute into a moral crusade about American identity and founding principles. Instead of arguing about the practical merits of different approaches to healthcare, Americans debate whether universal healthcare is constitutionally required or constitutionally forbidden. Instead of weighing the costs and benefits of gun control, Americans fight about whether the Second Amendment makes gun ownership a sacred right or allows reasonable regulation. The Supreme Court's role in this constitutional theology has become increasingly problematic. Court decisions aren't evaluated based on their practical consequences, but on their constitutional correctness, as if there were objective criteria for determining constitutional truth. Justices are treated like oracles whose task is to discover rather than create constitutional meaning. This has made Supreme Court nominations into religious wars about constitutional orthodoxy. Senators don't ask judicial nominees about their competence or judgment. They ask about their constitutional faith. Nominees are expected to demonstrate proper reverence for constitutional text and appropriate humility before constitutional wisdom. The confirmation process resembles theological examination more than job interview. The result is a political culture where constitutional arguments have replaced practical reasoning about governance. Americans spend enormous energy debating what the founders intended rather than what policies would work best today. They treat 18th century compromises as eternal truths, rather than historical solutions to specific problems. This constitutional worship has profound consequences for American democracy. It makes constitutional change almost impossible because any amendment seems like sacrilege against founding wisdom. It transforms policy debates into theological disputes about constitutional interpretation. It gives enormous power to judges who claim special authority to interpret constitutional meaning. Most problematically, constitutional worship makes Americans unwilling to acknowledge that their governing framework might be flawed or outdated. Instead of asking whether the Constitution serves contemporary needs, Americans assume it must be perfect and argue only about its proper interpretation. This makes adaptive governance nearly impossible and constitutional reform politically toxic. Consider how differently other democracies approach constitutional questions. The German Basic Law has been amended over 60 times since 1949. The French Constitution has been replaced entirely multiple times. Even the British, despite lacking a written constitution, regularly adapt their governing arrangements to meet changing circumstances. Only Americans treat their constitution as essentially perfect and unchangeable. This isn't because the American Constitution is objectively superior to other democratic frameworks. It's because Americans have developed a religious relationship with their founding document that makes rational evaluation nearly impossible. The psychological roots of constitutional worship run deep in American political culture. Americans need to believe their nation was founded on eternal principles rather than historical compromises because this validates their sense of national mission and moral superiority. Constitutional worship allows Americans to see themselves as the chosen people of liberty rather than one democracy among many. This religious approach to constitutional interpretation also serves important political functions. It allows politicians to wrap their preferences in constitutional authority, making opposition seem unpatriotic or unconstitutional. It gives judges enormous power while maintaining the fiction that they're simply discovering rather than creating law. It makes constitutional interpretation a specialized skill that requires professional training and expertise. But constitutional worship also creates serious problems for democratic governance. It makes constitutional interpretation too important to leave to democratic processes, giving enormous power to unelected judges. It transforms political disagreements into constitutional crises that threaten the legitimacy of government itself. It makes Americans unwilling to consider constitutional reforms that might improve democratic governance. The modern conservative movement's embrace of originalism illustrates both the appeal and the problems of constitutional worship. Originalists claim to be restoring constitutional government to its proper foundations, but they're actually intensifying constitutional theology by treating the founders as infallible prophets, whose intentions can be discovered through careful textual study. This approach makes constitutional interpretation even more priest-like because it requires specialized knowledge of 18th century history, political theory, and linguistic usage. Ordinary citizens become even more dependent on constitutional experts to tell them what their own governing document means. Democracy becomes theocracy with judges as priests and the Constitution as scripture. The liberal response to originalism, living constitution interpretation, seems more democratic but actually reinforces constitutional worship by treating the Constitution as infinitely adaptable rather than historically limited. Instead of acknowledging that the Constitution might be outdated, living constitutionalists claim it can mean whatever contemporary values require. This makes the Constitution even more sacred by making it eternally relevant. Both approaches avoid the obvious truth that the Constitution is a historical document written by fallible people to solve specific problems at a particular time. It contains some timeless wisdom about democratic governance, but it also reflects 18th century assumptions about everything from technology to social relations that may no longer be relevant. A more rational approach would treat the Constitution as a valuable but imperfect framework that should be evaluated based on how well it serves contemporary democratic needs. This might lead to constitutional reforms that improve representation, reduce political polarization, or make government more effective and accountable. But constitutional worship makes such rational evaluation nearly impossible because it requires treating the Constitution as a human creation rather than divine revelation. Americans would rather argue endlessly about what the founders intended than ask whether those intentions still make sense today. The irony is that the founders themselves would be appalled by contemporary constitutional worship. They were practical politicians who viewed the Constitution as an experiment that might need modification based on experience. Thomas Jefferson argued that constitutions should be rewritten every generation. James Madison expected the document would need frequent amendment. Alexander Hamilton acknowledged its imperfections and limitations. The founders would be mystified by Americans who treat their pragmatic compromises as eternal truths. They would be horrified by judges who claim special authority to interpret constitutional meaning. They would be astonished by politicians who invoke their authority to justify positions they never took on issues they never imagined. Contemporary constitutional worship represents the triumph of mythology over history, theology over pragmatism, and reverence over reason. Americans have transformed a practical governing framework into a sacred text, creating a civic religion that makes rational evaluation of their political institutions nearly impossible. This transformation has profound implications for American democracy's future. As the nation faces challenges the founders never imagined, from climate change to artificial intelligence to global economic integration, Americans need governing institutions that can adapt and evolve. But constitutional worship makes such adaptation nearly impossible because any change seems like sacrilege against founding wisdom. The result is a political system increasingly unable to address contemporary challenges because it's constrained by 18th century assumptions and structures. Americans argue endlessly about what the founders would have wanted rather than what contemporary circumstances require. They treat ancient compromises as eternal truths, rather than historical solutions that may no longer be relevant. Breaking free from constitutional worship doesn't require abandoning respect for constitutional principles or democratic governance. It simply requires treating the Constitution as what it actually is, a valuable but imperfect human creation that should be evaluated based on how well it serves contemporary needs rather than revered as divine revelation. This would allow Americans to have rational conversations about constitutional reform, judicial power, and democratic governance that are currently impossible because they seem to violate constitutional orthodoxy. It would permit the kind of institutional adaptation that other successful democracies take for granted, but Americans treat as heretical. Most importantly, it would restore democracy to democratic governance by making constitutional interpretation a civic responsibility rather than a priestly prerogative. Instead of depending on constitutional experts to tell them what their governing document means, Americans could evaluate it based on their own experience and judgment about what democratic governance requires. The choice facing Americans is whether to continue worshiping their Constitution as sacred scripture or to start treating it as what the founders intended, a practical framework for democratic governance that should be judged by its results rather than revered for its origins. The future of American democracy may depend on choosing reason over reverence, pragmatism over piety, and adaptation over adoration. As we conclude this exploration of America's unique relationship with its founding document, I want to thank you for joining me at Professor Archive. The story of how Americans transformed a practical governing framework into sacred scripture reveals so much about political culture, democratic governance, and the power of mythology in shaping national identity. Understanding constitutional worship helps explain why American political debates often seem so intense and uncompromising. They're not just about policy preferences, but about constitutional orthodoxy and national identity. It illuminates why institutional reform is so difficult in America compared to other democracies, and why Americans often seem more concerned with constitutional correctness than practical effectiveness. This phenomenon also raises important questions about the relationship between reverence and reason in democratic societies. Does treating founding documents as sacred help preserve democratic values, or does it prevent necessary adaptation to changing circumstances? Can democracies maintain legitimacy without constitutional mythology, or is some form of civic religion necessary for political stability? What's your perspective on this uniquely American phenomenon? Do you see constitutional worship in your own country's political culture, or does this seem distinctly American to you? How do you think democracies should balance respect for founding principles with the need for institutional adaptation? I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts, so please share them in the comments below. And don't forget to tell me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. Our community spans the globe, and I love seeing how these distinctly American stories resonate with people from different political traditions. If this deep dive into American political culture fascinated you, make sure you're subscribed to Professor Archive and have that notification bell activated. We explore the hidden forces that shape our world, from the grand narratives of political development to the intimate details of how societies create meaning and identity. Every week, we uncover stories that help us understand not just where we've been, but how we think about governance, authority, and democracy itself. The next time you hear Americans invoking the Constitution in political debates, you'll understand that you're witnessing not just legal argument, but religious ritual, the continuation of a civic faith that has shaped American politics for over 2 centuries. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking to understand the remarkable ways human societies create the stories that give meaning to political life. This is Professor Archive reminding you that the most important stories are often the ones that explain how we relate to power, authority, and the sacred in democratic societies.